My name's Heather Teal. I live in Applecross in the Highlands, northwest coast of Scotland. It's a very remote location. It's probably about as remote as you can get on the mainland. Over the Christmas period, we all had the flu. My son started first on Christmas Day, then me, my mother, and then Bethany. So by New Year, she was struggling. I took her to the doctor and I was told again that it was flu. By the time we got to the 5th day, she was struggling to breathe. They couldn't get a reading for her blood pressure. It was dangerously low, and we were airlifted to Regmore Hospital in Inverness. She went into cardiac arrest pretty much on the way up to the ward. She was intubated and wired up to absolutely everything, and there was somebody doing CPR. I was sitting at the end of her bed. They allowed me to sit there and hold her left leg, stroking her leg and willing her to live. Your brain is not wired to lose a child. It's the most horrific thing. And it's a physical pain when you lose a child. It's physical. I couldn't imagine how my life was going to continue. Sorry. And then after about 3 days, I guess, I answered the phone and it was a reporter from the local press. What I didn't realise at the time was that once they put it through to be published, every other editor can see that, and I was just inundated. Every time I answered the phone, it was a different newspaper, or it was one of Bethany's friends telling me that they were asking them questions. It was TV companies, it was Sky News, and just every time I picked up my phone, there was a message from somebody. Every time I picked up the house phone, there was a reporter on it. It was constant. Every time the phone went, there was a fear. A real fear that what was I going to be asked this time? They rang and messaged other people within the community. It just felt relentless. Trying to sensationalise the fact that an 18-year-old hadn't had a flu jab. It was sepsis that killed her, and all they wanted was some sensational story. One newspaper asked me how it felt being in intensive care watching my daughter die, what was going through my head at the time. And I put the phone down and he rang back several times, carrying on with the questions despite me breaking down. One reporter actually asked me why I wouldn't speak to him. When I said it was because I was grieving for my daughter, he said, yes, but I need you to speak to me because grief sells newspapers. That is one step too far. It's just, I can't even begin to tell you how much worse these people make the situation you're already going through. It's absolutely horrendous. To just constantly hound people, I just think is unforgivable. It's just, they nearly pushed me over the edge. They really did have me thinking about ending it all. There were photographs that were published in the newspapers of Bethany. Had they asked for a photograph, I would have provided one. But the ones that they had without permission. There was one of her receiving an award at school. That's a personal memory to me, to be there at the school and watch her get this award. It was one of the proudest moments of my life, and it's a moment I will treasure forever. And it's tainted because it was all over the newsstands for the wrong reasons. But for me, just at that moment in time, it was my story and it wasn't anybody else's. I didn't want to share it. I don't understand it. Surely there's a little bit of them that thinks, here's somebody whose world has just completely fallen apart. And I need to leave her alone. But they don't. I don't know. I just don't know. I just know that they need to stop.
My name's Luke Hart. At the moment we live in Surrey and I work in technology.
And I'm Ryan Hart. I live with Luke, and I'm an engineer. So on the 19th of July in 2016, our father killed our mum and our sister. And this was only 5 days after we had left him, in an attempt to try and get a better life away from him, away from his control, his abuse. Our father was influenced by what he'd read in the media. His murder note was constructed from previous reports of other domestic homicides. His search history on his computer was full of, men who murder their families, trying to figure out, what would be said about him when he went through with his plan. And so he was definitely looking to see what the media response would be before he committed the murders.
The media descended on Spalding. And there was helicopters, there was people everywhere, there was journalists jumping through people's windows that we knew, trying to get quotes that they could use. The media reporting showed an overwhelming sympathy and concern for our father and a total lack of concern for Mum and Charlotte, who seemed to just be props in our father's story, right? They were just collateral damage to our father's poor mental health. But our father didn't have mental health issues in the traditional sense. What he had was an obsession with control. The media had framed things exactly how our father would always frame them. And for Ryan and I, the biggest shock was seeing reports and stories of our family that weren't our stories, they were his. A lot of them mentioned the suicide note he left behind at the scene, and that was a suicide note to him, but it was a murder note to us, and much of the content was explaining why he wanted to kill us all. The day that we left, Mum, basically, she made him sandwiches, right, and left him a note saying, I'll email you. We took ketchup, because that was the only thing we had. We just got pizza and ketchup, and that was literally going to be our lunch when we got to the new house. And one of the reasons our father was going to murder us all was because we took ketchup, and we should have known how much he likes ketchup. The narratives were incredibly misogynistic. Even the reports that were supposed to be from kind of neutral, sophisticated outlets, they didn't understand domestic abuse, right? They just didn't get it. They were making all sorts of assumptions, even providing excuses for our father. People were saying, oh, he must have had a hard childhood, saying he was a good guy who was always caring, and well, they were giving him a lot of eulogising, a lot of sympathy.
And on top of the sympathy we saw for our father, there was a lot of attack on our mum's character. People who didn't know our families would give quotes and they would be taken out of context and turned into statements of fact. And one was that our mum had apparently had an affair. Also another one was assumptions that our mum was leaving our father for the money. It was devastating, I think, for us to read. She was the most amazing woman I'd ever known. She'd been through so much suffering in her life, and I could, it was unbearable what she'd been through. And it really achieved what our father wanted, was after the murders, for him and his story to live on, and for Mum and Charlotte to be seen as, the villains and him the victim.
And also it was just embarrassing because it made me sort of reflect on the fact that being a man, whatever the standard for that is so incredibly low that you can murder your family and you're still a good guy. Hearing all of that made us so blindly angry that the only thing we could do after the murders was basically shut ourselves off. And we just stopped living, basically. Or we looked after our dogs, we went for walks. And that was, for me, the only way to sort of process it was just to disconnect from it.
I think being forced to shut off completely certainly, delayed our recovery from what we've been through.
My name is Mandy Garner. I live in Northfield in Essex. I have 4 children. I'm a journalist, and I also work for a human rights organisation. On the 19th of February, my daughter was out with her boyfriend and his friend in Brixton, and a car which was going over 60 miles an hour went through 2 red lights and then hit my daughter, flinging her up into the air, and didn't stop. That happened at 9:45 at night, and the police came to our house at 2 o'clock in the morning. My other daughter, Maya, and I were awake, they told us what had happened, and they stayed with us until sort of first thing in the morning, and then we had to basically wait for our other children to wake up to tell them And it was at midday that day that the Daily Mail put the CCTV video of what had happened up on their website. My brother-in-law saw it and my brother saw it. So they told me about it. I mean, I just thought it was obvious to me that it was a clickbait type story. It was just it was just a kind of voyeuristic thing to get clicks. So what seemed to have happened was that the Daily Mail said they had the CCTV footage. They bought it from the shop that was opposite where she was crossing the road. The police said, don't put it up. The Daily Mail said, you can't stop us, we're going to put it up. The police said, at least give us some time to tell the family. And the Daily Mail said, well, you've got an hour. They came up with it was in the public interest. The story was to bring forward witnesses. And then I looked at the headline again, and the headline is, and I've got it written down here, it's exclusive, first of all, exclusive in capital letters. Shocking moment, young woman is killed by speeding hit-and-run driver escaping police as she is flung 20 feet into the air and lands in front of horrified onlookers at London bus stop. That is the headline. There's nothing in there that suggests that they want witnesses to come forward or that is in the public interest. That is just, watch this video of this girl who's just about to get killed. And so I put in a complaint to IPSO for intrusion into grief. So IPSO asked me some questions, and then they sent those to the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail then replied. Then I had to reply to the Daily Mail, and this went on backwards and forwards for a long time. And every time that I got an email, it just brought it back up again. So you're constantly reliving that night. And then they came out saying it wasn't an intrusion into grief. I was literally shaking. I was so angry and upset. So then I wrote back to IPSO. They said, maybe you could help out with training our people about how to handle these cases. And I was like, really? I mean... And then they said that the video was quite grainy, so you wouldn't be able to know who it was. Anybody who knows my daughter knows that that's about her. My children know that that's about her. And they said that it was sensitively edited. So it was edited so that it didn't show the actual impact, just the moments before. That is not sensitive. That is the worst part, because that's the bit as a parent that you play over and over in your head, that those seconds, those last seconds, what was going through her head, and you're trying to save her, you know? That's all I do. No, I'm just trying to save her. I couldn't.
Why does the law in this country allow them to do it? Why do people who have suffered a tragedy not get some form of protection from that? Without a shadow of a doubt, they are going to damage people, and eventually somebody will harm themselves because of it. And it has to stop.
These men who kill their families, they are conscious about what is said about them after the fact. And therefore, if we can improve the quality of reporting, then hopefully that will reduce the instances of domestic homicide.
This kind of regulation that is by the press, for the press, it's not working. I just do feel a duty to talk about it, because we can do better. We must do better.
It's a moment I will treasure forever. and it's tainted because it was all over the newsstands.
To see posthumously her being attacked by a lot of the mainstream media, it was devastating, I think, for us to read.
That's all I do. No, I'm just trying to save her, and I couldn't.
We can do better, we must do better. I think you'll agree, a very powerful film. I'm Jacqui Hames, a Hacked Off Board Director with lead responsibility for our work as advocates for victims of press abuse. Hacked Off exists to campaign for press freedom but with accountability. Rarely do newspapers cover misconduct, so it's a really important part of our work to share these stories and to give a voice to victims of press abuse denied to them by the mainstream media outlets. One of the film's participants, Mandy Garner, inspired us when she explained how rare it is for press complaints handler Ipso to uphold complaints into intrusion into grief or shock, Clause 4 of the Editor's Code of Practice. So we commissioned this film to tell the victims' stories, often for the first time, and express what it meant to them. So thank you again to all those who appeared and experienced press abuse in such a direct and acute way, and the others who campaign with us. And I'm delighted to introduce this very special panel. Firstly, we're joined by Sheila Hollins, a member of the House of Lords and founder of the charity Beyond Words, also Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at University of London. Sheila and her family experienced press intrusion after her daughter was attacked in 2005, and she's often spoken on the topic of press behaviour in Parliament. We're also delighted to welcome Eleanor Penny, a journalist whose work has been widely published, including The Independent, The New Statesman, and regularly writes for Novara Media. Eleanor is also a multi-award-winning poet and a published author, so welcome to Eleanor. Elizabeth Mizon, a filmmaker and journalist whose bylines include Open Democracy, Novara Media, Netflix and the Bristol Cable. And finally, Nathan Sparks, Hacked Off's chief executive, who worked on the film. My first question is to Sheila, to Baroness Hollins. In your experience as a psychiatrist and as someone who's seen and experienced press intrusion at first hand, what effect can this kind of press behaviour have on families who've experienced trauma?
Well, at a time when you actually want people to say, how can I help? What can I do for you? What would help? To actually have people taking stuff from you, intruding, is... I mean, one of the, I think more than one of the contributors in the film said it, but it's worse than anything else. You know, to have people spying on you, taking your words, maybe misusing them, putting headlines which misrepresent you, the pain of that. It so exaggerates anything else that is going on. I can quite understand why Bethany's mum felt that, you know, was life worth it? And you could say, well, of course she lost her daughter. You know, just to make sense of what's happened in your life, you really don't need cameras outside. You really don't need every knock on the door to be a bunch of flowers from a journalist, possibly with a microchip inside. You really don't need phone calls for people you don't know asking you questions. I got quite good when my daughter was in this situation at guessing who it was walking up the drive. I'd think, oh, right, I know that. I know that's how journalists from that organisation behave. That's how they walk. That's what they carry. That's what they wear. And I would say, oh, you're from so-and-so. And they'd say, how did you know? I'd say, oh, I've met your type before. Went on for months. It actually went on for longer than months. It is so debilitating. so wearing. There's so much more that we know about mental health now. And on the one hand, you could say that we're more respectful of people who have difficulties with their mental health. We're more respectful, more understanding. But actually, I don't think that's showing any change in the way that the media are behaving. So, there's more discourse about mental health, but actually the behaviour, if it's going to sell a newspaper, seems to be excused. I think those stories, those people's lives, tragic things had happened to them, and yet there was no respect for them.
And there's almost no excuse, as you say. Discussions about mental health and impact on
we should know.
Health are widely done now.
Yes, and I think it shows a complete lack of any emotional literacy. It's kind of like not getting it, not understanding, or not wanting to get to understand, not wanting to know, not wanting to get it. And I think that's just so hard.
Yes, not wanting to get it. In your role as a member of the House of Lords, you've raised this issue many times. How important is it for MPs and peers to hear these stories like these?
I think a lot of MPs really believe that things have changed. They really think that since all the debates and all the discussions and attempts at legislation, things have changed, but they haven't. Not enough. And there may be more awareness. I think it's incredibly important that this is kept in people's hearts and minds. I mean, I rather understand that there are going to be attempts by the government to try to row back on some of the changes that were made. I mean, that would be terrible. But of course, there are lots of new members of Parliament, lots of new members of the House of Lords who weren't there when the Leveson inquiry happened and when the changes that took place afterwards happened. So it would be a bit like starting again.
So we need to keep these issues in their consciousness.
Kept in public consciousness and kept in the and new parliamentarians need to be kind of have their eyes opened and to understand. And it's like every generation having to learn. If only we could set a better framework for improved behaviour. If only.
I'm interested to know what you would say to a reporter or a journalist who's grappling with these editorial issues and balancing between the public's right to know and actually intruding into people's lives unnecessarily.
Does the public have a right to know about acute grief? Does it have a right to know the personal details when a tragic accident has happened? Why? What is the public interest in that? I mean, there's a public interest in knowing about maybe crime statistics or knowing about, how much domestic violence there is, about knowing about how many people have died of sepsis. But do we have to know all the details of the individuals and their lives and their families? Why is that a public interest? It isn't, is it? I can't see that it is. I mean, if a family chooses, having experienced something, to actually say, we'd like to share our experience in order that other people can understand that actually, life does get better, you can find a way, or whatever it might be, or whatever they choose to say, that's one thing. But to actually have to leave the hospital and have banks of cameras waiting to try to find you, or friends ringing up and saying, oh, I've got a journalist here and they're wanting to know, and I'm wondering which, my daughter's grandmother, I'm wondering, there's a journalist in my room and won't leave until I give her a photograph, and I'm wondering which one to give her. I mean, that is not good journalistic practice. And it's not in the public interest. It's only in the interest of selling the newspaper. That's not okay. That's not okay.
What would you like to see happen now in Parliament?
Oh, I'd love to see Leveson Part 2, of course. I would love to see Leveson Part 2.
The regulatory framework that he suggested, which would give more protection.
Yes. And of course, things have moved on. I mean, the social media issues are huge and changed since 10 years ago. But so some of that needs to be kind of updated and so on. Of course, we've got some legislation coming about online safety. Maybe that can deal with some of it. But I worry about a government that is not prepared to stand up to the media.
Mm-hmm. I'd actually like to turn to one of our journalists here, Eleanor. As somebody who works in and around journalism, politics and the media, what was your reaction to the stories that you've just seen in that film?
I'm sure, like anyone who spends any time with these people's stories, it's just the first impulse is heartbreak, of course, and that is the central irony here, because the way in which the press routinely appeals to a kind of spectral idea of the public interest, of the public who they are supposed to serve, in order to shore up their own interest, in order to create a kind of protective political envelope around what is basically business interest or political interest. This is the public who they're supposed to be serving, right? When you get down to it, here are the people in whose name they are defending themselves against regulation. And obviously, the stories that we've just seen are testament to the fact that they will run roughshod over anyone's grief, anyone's trauma, that they are very happy to re-traumatize anyone in the attempt to pursue their own interests. But I think we need to be very clear about the fact that while these are extremely kind of sharp and glowingly tragic instances of press abuse, of abuse of power, that these kinds of problems of the abuse of power and the huge ramifications on the entirety of our political life, on the entirety of our social life, on the way that we live together, on the way that we imagine the us to whom politics is supposed to relate and to whom it's supposed to operate. These problems are everywhere. And even if we, for some, to me, unimaginable reason, can't imagine ourselves in a situation like Heather's or a situation like Luke's, we still are in a poisoned political well that results from press trying to have it both ways, right? Trying to say, on one hand, you can't regulate us, there's no way we can talk about ownership, there's no way we can talk about antitrust legislation because this is a free speech issue. And the importance of free speech issue is because the press has a huge role in shaping the terrain of political possibility, and so, which is absolutely true, right? Can all agree that's an important fundamental right. However, they affirm that as a positive duty only when it comes to trying to get out of jail free, when it comes to the actual consequences of their actions. And when you confront them with the responsibilities that that freedom comes with, they will deny to the hilt the power that they actually have, right? Throughout Leveson inquiry, the lead up to it, you know, I think it was 2002 that these sort of phone hacking allegations started to emerge. Throughout that time period and ever since, there's been this appeal to a kind of nebulous sense of the market or the public, as if they're just kind of channeling some kind of entity over which they have no control. It's not really us, the buck stops somewhere else, right? You can't have it both ways. Either you are a political entity with political power and political interests that need to be confronted and regulated and owned collectively and democratically overseen, or you're just providing a service neutrally. Who can blame you? You're just a businessman, right? Pick a struggle.
Yes, some very interesting points there. Luke and Ryan's story in particular showed how misogyny in the press impacted them. It's so interesting. Why is it so hard to get newspapers to stop peddling harmful sexist narratives, especially around violence against women?
Well, that story was just, I mean, so heartbreaking and so just disgusting, however you cut it, right? We need to be very clear about the working conditions under which these editorial decisions are being made, right? The kinds of businesses that often set these editorial lines are themselves often plagued with abuse, plagued with misogyny, plagued with harassment, violence against women. You know, Fox News has paid out tens of millions of pounds in settlements for similar allegations of harassment in the workplace. So it's I think it's worthwhile thinking about the kinds of organisations and the kinds of personnel who might be disinterested in a more profound analysis of what sustains these systems of power that undergird and provide the possibility conditions in which abuse occurs. But moreover, I think there's a kind of broader problem with how we all talk about violence against women and domestic abuse against anyone. And that's because the ways in which the press is not prepared to admit a particularly wide scope of possibility of solutions, and what that would mean for our current political system and currently the way we organise our economic lives and our intimate lives, means that only a certain small amount of diagnoses are available to them when it comes to confronting these issues.
So it's a preordained narrative that they're playing.
Right, it's very easy and cheap to blame women and to exceptionalise the men who commit what is an endemic issue, what is an endemic form of violence, to say it's a tiny number of monstrous men in a very small number of cases, or in a more general sense, it's probably the woman's fault, and why didn't she leave? All these kinds of things that we've heard a million times before, right? If we were to actually confront the problems of policing, of childcare, of the way in which we organise family law, of the way in which we pathologise misogyny as an individual problem rather than a structural problem, that implies a radical policy programme that, if you've been paying any attention to the past couple of decades, especially the last 5 years, you will not be surprised to learn that the Murdoch press is not going to get behind that kind of programme that would actually help people, that would actually resolve these kinds of problems and give people a literal lifeline out of these systems of abuse. And it's incredibly frustrating to see over and over again when women are murdered. We are so ready to pour empathy into their murderers and so ready to demonise them, because the other solution is changing the way we do politics and changing the way we organise society, and heaven forfend that is on the cards.
So actually the power is not with the politicians, it's with the media barons, if you like, the people responsible for the narrative that is put out each time.
I mean, there's a huge revolving door in terms of the upper echelons of UK politics and UK media. So often these are literally the same people making the same decisions. But I think that there's a profound disinterest in regulating media, curtailing media power, because for us who can see that this is these stories are one of the outcomes of the system, for us we can clearly see that the system is broken, but it is functioning perfectly well in terms of smoothing a path for the operation of a particular kind of way of doing politics. So why should there be any interest in reform? Perhaps I'm overly cynical here, but I don't think that it's a question of like, is it the media or is it the politicians, when there's such a hand in glove relationship between the two to make it sometimes academic to define the difference.
I want to bring in Elizabeth, because as an experienced journalist yourself, why do you think unwanted intrusion and abusive press coverage still continues today?
I mean, when I first watched the film, the thing that after the rage had subsided, the first thing that I thought was, I feel as though I was thinking about gladiators, that that we kind of haven't really moved on from this idea that, firstly, that we have a right to spectacle, that we have a right to essentially harm other people for our own entertainment, and I think that there's first, the harm that we may be looking at, say, for example, a car crash or something like that. But then there's the harm of the intrusion, in a secondary instance. So the fact that, the idea that we kind of have a right to this kind of entertainment, I think it's really archaic. And that's something for me that comes up again and again about the kind of archaic sort of bog that the media industry is still in. So I think that there's a cultural issue there, there's an industrial issue there, but then I think that it is also a regulation issue as well, that the IPSO is absolutely not fit for purpose, and they've made that clear over and over again. I think it's amazing that it can say in the editor's code, you should not intrude into shock and grief, and then every single time they do intrude into shock and grief, they deliver a decision that says, this is why we intruded into the shock and grief, and this is why it was okay for us to do that. That doesn't make sense, and I think that anybody with their head screwed on can see that that doesn't make sense.
So what's it like as a reporter being put in the position of going to pursue a story like that and being told that get the victim's view or the family member's view no matter what?
I mean, I was going to say I never have pursued a story like that, but in fact I have pursued a story like that. I have done a bit of court reporting into an inquest about a suicide, and I was really frightened to talk to the family. In fact, they had wanted us there, and they approached me, and I was very grateful for that, because I thought, gosh, how do I walk up to these people and speak to these people? And I found it I really had to kind of cut off my emotions to an extent just to be able to have a conversation with two grieving parents, who reminded me of my own parents very much. And it was really, really difficult. And so I don't feel like I can answer your question really, because I cannot imagine being in a headspace where, other than, yes, you do just have to cut off your emotions, but I don't want to be on my high horse, but for me it was to sort of protect myself from feeling, God, this is awful. But to actually go to the home of a family and to have to cut yourself off to that extent, to say, I'm here even though I know you don't want me here, I just don't really know why that's happening from a human point of view. I understand why it's happening from an economic point of view, and why people, may be bullied into doing that by their editor, for example. But as an individual person trying to justify that to themselves, I do not know how people are doing it. I just don't know how they're doing it.
As a media reform activist, what changes would you like to see?
I think that, that a lot of the things that have already been mentioned, the economics of the industry, the regulation, all of those things absolutely have to change. I think that there are a lot of organisations doing a lot of good work, Hacked Off, of course, being one of them. And I think that as a community of people who are trying to improve on this issue, I think that I would really like to see a coming together of all of these groups and a more concerted explanation of what is happening here. That's one of the things I think this film does really well, is that it's giving us a very, very simple, this is what happens and these are the effects. This is the results of our, gladiatorial sort of desire to intrude on people's lives. I think that it's a really, really good example of how you can very simply just cut through any kind of, legal or sort of moralistic bullshit about why we should be allowed to do this, or why we did that and why you can't fine us for it. It just cuts through it and says, this is what's happening, this is people's lives, and they are being ruined.
So in this new sort of internet highway we're living in now, there are different ways and new ways emerging of how to get your news, broadcast news in particular, but there are still new formats in print as well. I know you work for the Bristol Cable, which is a cooperative. Are these sorts of new media breaking this conglomerate that has dominated for so many years?
I'm really, really hopeful about the future of new and independent media in the UK, and there are lots of smaller outlets that are really good examples of, you know, the way that journalism can be done and should be done and could be done. I think the Cable is a really, really good example because it is partly funded by its membership, so people become members and they give, you know, a certain amount a month in the same way that you would if you subscribed to, I don't know, the Guardian or the FT or, you know, the Times or whatever. But you can access it for free. So you can access the Bristol Cable website for free. They also have a print copy that gets distributed around the city for free. But if you want to support and you want to be a member, you can. You can do that for a really low amount. I think the lowest is about £3 a month. And the members get a say in what the paper does. So if they think that the paper hasn't been covering a certain issue enough, they can say so at the AGM. Or if they feel that the paper hasn't done, you know, something correctly, if they feel that they've done something in an irresponsible way, they can say so at the AGM. I mean, they can say so by an email, a strongly worded email at any time. But, you know, they get a say in what is covered and how it's covered. And many members just want them to, you know, go ahead because they are regulated by Impress. So they do actually have plenty in place in order to make sure that they're doing their jobs properly.
So the regulation from Impress isn't restricting the way they cover stories?
No, not at all. I think this idea of, you know, regulation being some sort of state-imposed control, I think is ridiculous. It's the idea that, you know, it's a very sort of libertarian idea that we should all just be allowed to do whatever we want. We all of us have several different types of rights, right? We have all of these rights. It's my right, if I want to walk up to somebody in the street and insult them, but I'm not going to do that because just because it's my right doesn't mean it's a good idea. And I think that, you know, the idea that we shouldn't have any regulation because that's state control. I mean, I'm really, really pleased I have to have a driver's license before I can operate a car. I don't think it's, you know, the state interfering in my life to say that. So I think it's really important that we understand that regulation is, you know, a lot of people, for example, Hacked Off, are calling for independent regulation. The press is currently self-regulating, and we've seen that is not working. What we need is an independent regulator. And Impress is that, but there's no reason there can't be more.
I'm curious about your take, Elizabeth, on, I guess, the role of workplace organising in forestalling this kind of instances, which we've kind of glanced at during this discussion, the idea of the journalist who probably hasn't gone into journalism in order to harass grieving families, but is being browbeaten by their editor to get a certain angle, etc., etc., etc. I feel like there is a solution to those kinds of situations in other industries where your boss is pressuring you to do something that you find kind of morally abhorrent, but you know, we don't necessarily have that much of a cultural memory of, say, the Wapping disputes, which were, you know, went on longer than the miners' strikes, right? And the crushing of them was very important to the success of Thatcherism in many ways. And, you know, we work in such an under-unionised industry. I genuinely struggle to imagine what a kind of a unionised world of journalism would look like. I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, the NUJ has been around for, I think, something like a century now, maybe over a century now. And I know that there are quite a lot of unionised workplaces in the UK. But that said, it's, you know, the industry has so much power. I think I saw recently that the Guardian had raised their freelance rates, and you know, everybody was very, very happy about that, of course. But they had done so for the first time in a decade, and so the idea that, you know, we are many newsrooms are unionised, and the union is there, and it's a kind of nationwide union. And it's getting all of these wins where it can, but it doesn't seem to at the moment have, you know, a huge amount of fight against this incredibly powerful industry, which is, as you noted earlier, owned by, you know, basically like 3 blokes. And so it's, you know, it's a really, really interesting kind of consolidation of power among a very few people. And even though there are far more journalists, many of whom are unionised, it's, you know, it's like walking through hummus to try and get any of these actual changes made. And I think that quite a few people as well have reported, you know, even if they are unionised, being fired because they have fought against editorial decisions.
What's certainly the case is that the editor's code, which is what IPSO uses, is very weak in terms of protections for journalists. And in contrast with the Impress code, which is the independent regulator, that code has a clause which says you have to, for example, make sure that journalists are properly credited for their work, that there's proper attribution, and when someone's written an article or contributed to it, that's acknowledged and recognised. And there's no equivalent clause in the editor's code. In fact, we've recently worked with an individual who used to work for an IPSO member publisher who found that bylines were being removed from his articles, and he complained to IPSO and got nowhere. And he's now gone off and actually set up his own local newspaper, which is a member of Impress. So it's clearly very much the case that the IPSO system, while being bad for the public, because it deprives us of kind of access to kind of a competent kind of complaints mechanism and everything else, it's also bad for journalists. And the code that they use, it's called the editor's code. And that's right, it's written by a majority of editors, not journalists, not working journalists who are kind of at the coalface writing the articles day to day, by their bosses. So it's a real kind of issue. This is an issue for journalists as well as the public.
Mandy Garner, one of the participants in the film, spoke about how rarely press complaints handler IPSO uphold complaints on intrusion into shock and grief. What are the statistics on that?
Yes, so we did some research, and IPSO's been around for 8 years now, and in that time they've received, or they processed 255 complaints of intrusion into grief or shock, and we found only 7 of those have been upheld over the last 8 years. That's less than 3%, and that's 255 people, families, who consider themselves to have been intruded on by the press after a terribly traumatic incident of some kind, and fewer than 3% of them have been able to get any kind of remedy through IPSO, and in no cases have IPSO either launched an investigation or fined a newspaper. And what's important to stress about all this is that the IPSO complaints process, on average, Mandy described it very well in the film, of course, because she went through it. On average, it lasts about 6 months, and it's just an incredibly attritional and quite cruel, in our view, process where the complainant has to write in, and they get a response from the people who have abused them, who they allege have been responsible for this behaviour, from the newspapers, who are represented by someone salaried, while this person does it in their own time while they're working and they've got other commitments. And also, in cases of intrusion into grief, almost immediately after a bereavement often, or some other kind of traumatic incident. Now, we just feel it's incredibly cruel to put someone through that process where they're having to put in a number of hours and do their own work all along the way, and then for fewer than 3% of them to be upheld. It's so some other research we've done has shown that well over 1,000 people just give up on IPSO complaints as they travel through, and it's no surprise, because if you're going through that process and having to relive it every time you get another email and everything else.
Is there an appeals process?
There is an appeals process, but I have never known it to have been successful. It's a question we would ask of IPSO. Can they show us a single complaint where there's been a successful appeal? You can't appeal the merits of the decision itself. You can only appeal on the process. And as I say, we've never known it, and we advise dozens of complainants every year. We've never known it to be successful.
And Nathan, of course, the Leveson recommendations included a low-cost arbitration service, which was never introduced. How could that have affected what happened to the victims that we saw in that film? How would it have helped them?
On this particular code clause, I suppose the most likely legal area that might have been breached is privacy in relation to these into the deaths. And that is one of the examples of media law that would be covered by the arbitration system. So Impress operates an arbitration system that's compulsory for publishers, and it means that if an Impress member is responsible for unlawful behaviour, for example, unlawful privacy intrusion, then it's possible for someone to bring a legal claim. It doesn't cost them anything to do so it's open to everyone. It's also very cheap for the publisher to defend themselves because unlike in the courts, you're not paying huge amounts of money to lawyers and so on. So it's just cheaper and quicker for everyone. And that's kind of the why Leveson recommended the arbitration system, because it's better for both sides. And it would end the problem for publishers of kind of wealthy litigants threatening legislation, trying to sort of force a story to be dropped. But so it kind of levels the playing field in legal cases, as it were. But because if you're playing so many games over the course of a season, and if most of the games you're playing, you're at the top of the hill, and someone in the opposing team is at the bottom of the hill, an unlevel playing field suits you. So newspapers have opposed it, because more often than not, they are the wealthier side in cases. So more often than not, it's the person, the claimant, who is of very modest means, who can't afford to bring an action, who so it suits newspapers. It has done quite well to kind of oppose that level of the playing field system. And it's exactly the people like those in the film that arbitration was designed to help.
And the abuse of power that Eleanor was speaking about is thus, exacerbated by that kind of system.
Exactly.
And finally, I wonder if Nathan and Sheila maybe can comment on what can parliamentarians do? What needs to change?
As Sheila and us on the panel have said, as well, as we need them to introduce the remainder of the Leveson reforms. And what Leveson said is that publishers should have incentives to sign up to an independent system of regulation. And if they choose not to, then there should be some form of compulsion. But the end result has to be the same, that national newspapers are in a form of independent regulation. And this is another point that the other panelists explained, which is that there's some people who think you can't have good journalism that holds power to account and exposes wrongdoing without also having bad journalism. And we say that's nonsense. Of course you can. You can have a journalism that exposes the powerful and speaks up for the public interest. That's the common pattern here, is speaking on behalf of the public interest. You can have that kind of journalism and not have the kind of journalism that exploits people in the times of terrible misery and suffering for more clicks and advertising revenue.
I'd agree with all of that. The best way of trying to achieve change, legislative change is often what's required, but legislative change isn't enough. And this is always the difficulty. But trying to achieve legislative change just requires keeping an eye out the whole time for opportunities. And of course, the other thing is trying to raise the awareness and trying to ensure that the current parliamentarians are actually well informed, so that when the opportunity arises to try to change something, that there are enough informed people to really have a chance of making it happen. I just remember long nights of debate and votes being passed in the House of Lords and overturned in the House of Commons, and sometimes it's very difficult to achieve a change if the government of the day has a majority and is absolutely determined not to allow that change to take place. So it's on the one hand, it is being opportunistic about it, but it's also about maintaining a level of understanding. And I hope this film is going to go some way to, to helping to achieve that, and to increasing the number of friends that good journalism needs.
And as you said, earlier, we need politicians to listen to people like Heather and Mandy and Luke and Ryan, and a bit less to Rupert Murdoch and other people who they think might help them at election time. We need them to listen to members of the public and people who have experienced this kind of abuse.
Yeah. Well, and of course MPs should, because their constituents are going to be the people who are hurt, and so it's kind of hard to imagine that anybody would put the powerful press barons ahead of their own constituents. Their own constituents are the people that vote. But of course, if they're reading, untruths, or they're being persuaded to buy newspapers because of sensational stories, then their worldview is going to be distorted. And I think, that's just very hard.
And on that note, thank you, all four of you. It's been absolutely fascinating having this discussion and to hear your reflections on that film. And that film is one that, as a group, we are really proud of. Thank you so much for coming today and having this discussion. And thank you for watching our film and listening to this discussion, and also thank you to the team who made it, and most importantly, thank you to those victims who were willing to share those stories. This matters. We are the only ones telling these stories and giving the public the voice that they've been denied. Please support the work of Hacked Off by visiting our website at hackinginquiry.org. Thank you for watching and listening to our panel this evening. This is really important. It affects every single one of you and anyone who's interested in what's really happening in this country.